And hello, welcome to the Social Justice Forum. I am your host, Daren Jaime. We thank you for joining us. Now, if you're asking the question, what is this show all about? Well, we bring you a forum discussing the issues, I should say, the inequities that so many people face, things such as systemic inequalities from pressing social problems. Our guests provide multiple perspectives and insights to help us better understand and address these challenges. So we invite you to stay connected to us as the Social Justice Forum starts right now. And welcome back. In today's corporate world, fostering an inclusive culture is not just a goal, but a necessity. Our first guest sheds light on the historical ties between white supremacy and the challenges Black individuals face in their pursuit of racial justice. Now, as workplaces navigate the complexities of diversity, this book serves as a valuable resource to deepen understanding and guide corporate initiatives. Joining us in sharing this point of view, we've got the professor of political science at Brown University and the author of Black Grief, White Grievance, Dr. Juliet Hooker. And Dr. Juliet, thank you for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
When we talk about Black Grief, White Grievance, you get to this title by how?
So basically, what I argue in the book is that Black grief and white grievance are two of the main drivers of mobilization around race in the United States right now. And there are two ways in which people are responding to real and perceived loss. And Black grief is an example of that, of course, are the protests against police violence, the racial justice protests that, for example, we had in the summer of 2020 after the killing of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. And Black White Grievance, was, for example, very clear in the January 6th protest, the refusal to accept the loss that fueled that attempt to overthrow a legitimate election.
Yeah. And when we talk about the protests and we talk about going back in history, I mean, it definitely was a trying time. We're all indoors, COVID. You don't just have George Floyd. You got Breonna Taylor. You got Ahmaud Arbery. There is this picture that America now gets to see front and center when it comes to Black grief. And I think that sometimes a lot of people didn't have the opportunity of really actualizing it until we actually saw it on video.
Mm. Yeah, there is a long tradition of these images of Black pain and suffering being used to mobilize people to support progress towards racial justice, right? It happened in the 1950s and 1960s after the funeral of Emmett Till and that his mother's decision to have an open casket and showing what they had done to her boy, as she said. And we saw it more recently with the viral videos of police killings going back to, Eric Garner, Michael Brown's body lying in the street in Ferguson. And so these images, I think, have become kind of flashpoints for people then becoming mobilized to actually support, trying to address systemic racism in many cases.
When we talk about protests that we see nowadays, we see Black Lives Matter. Of course, they were the picture most recently when it came to the killing of George Floyd. But we've seen protests down through the years. Give me your assessment as to what we're seeing by way of our voice and really being taken seriously. I think to a certain extent, a lot of people didn't think that much would come of these protests after George Floyd, but really it went from a moment to a movement.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to think about the protests in 2020, and the real emergence of the movement for Black Lives as a really important moment in which we had some of the most sustained, broadest, largest protest that we've had in the United States since the 1960s, and particularly for causes related to racial justice. And I think that it's easy to say, that the protests were not successful. But on the other hand, I think the conversations that we now have around, you know, um, what the discretion that prosecutors use, how we should think about the criminal justice system, how we should think about what the role of the police is. All of those conversations have changed dramatically as a result of those protests, and the calls to think differently and approach questions of the how we address, for example, mental people who are in crisis with mental health, and how that often becomes the role that the police have to play, but they're not the most effective or useful in those situations. And so I think, we've had a very different conversation now around those issues than we were having, 20 years ago.
Let's talk about activism for a minute and really the end result. When we look back at 2020, and you look back at the George Floyd protests, I mean, you saw massive people really breaking social protocol, knowing that we should be home, but yet still taking to the street because they said, in essence, enough is enough. But then to push that out even further, think about the fact of how we saw the NBA shut it down. Tennis athletes, I'm not going out to play. These things really were the catalyst for a worldwide, change, if you will. Talk to me a little bit about Black activism and the effect that it has, not just locally, but globally.
Yeah, one of the things that I talk about in Black Grief, White Grievance is the history of Black activism and the ways in which, um, progress towards racial justice, right? These big moments that we think of, where there is real change and transformation in the United States, have really been the result of heroic forms of Black activism. But I also think we need to think about the ways in which that is a huge expectation and burden that we place on Black people, and the ways in which that activism is still not often received in the way that it should be. So even you talk about the protests by athletes, and those were the most peaceful protests you could imagine, right? People kneeling. There was no form of violence whatsoever, and yet many were equally upset and critical of those forms of protest. So I think one of the things that is really important to pay attention to is the way in which Black activism plays this heroic role, but it is also very often not met with, you know, it's met with criticism and is severely constrained by these really very limiting expectations of what the right way to protest is in order for Black people to have their issues heard.
I think sometimes it exists, and maybe you could elaborate a little bit further about it, because we're often introduced to the nonviolent protests, and we talk about the nonviolent protests, and the nonviolent protesters are the ones who sometimes are quote unquote glorified. But when we do see those who've taken the violent route, we were forced to almost make a decision, Martin or Malcolm. Then you got the Black Panthers, Huey, all. Talk to me a little bit about the nonviolent and the violent and the perception.
Yeah, I think this is a really important question, right? There is the sense that if Black people protest in just the right way, if they follow the script of the civil rights movement, and this is, this very romantic official narrative that we now have of, MLK was this super civil person, and and people made these demands, and there was immediate change. But, MLK was actually not popular at the time. He was seen as this outside agitator. People compared the civil rights activists to the Ku Klux Klan and said they were the same. And so, these radicals. And so I think, there is um, uh, we have forgotten, right, how controversial the civil rights protests were, and so we have this idea that if Black people can just protest in this really civil way, that that's the way that you get change to happen. But in fact, even nonviolent, even super civil protests are actually quite controversial because they're pushing for change in entrenched structures. So that's the conundrum.
Yeah. Just going back to your book, it talks about resistance to integration in the 1960s. And, when we talk about resistance, I want to talk about, societal change and contemporary challenges. And what lessons can we learn out of that?
So, one of the arguments that I make in the book is that, we often worry about, let's say, violent Black protests and Black anger. But in fact, the greatest threat to US democracy right now is white grievance, right? This refusal to accept the loss that has been a constant feature in US. History, whenever there's been some progress towards greater racial equality, there has been racist backlash by some white folks who have been resistant to those changes. And we are seeing this. We saw that in the 1960s, and we're seeing it now, where, and after the 2020 protests, you see this whole wave of, attempts to dismantle affirmative action, to gut the Voting Rights Act, which is an ongoing thing, right? The sense that, um, the country's too woke, and we are not, we've gone too far, when in fact, white supremacy and systemic racial discrimination persists. And that's the same pattern of the people who were resistant to integration, to full civil rights in the 60s, and who immediately, as Dr. King said at the time, set about trying to undermine the victories that the civil rights protesters had won at the time.
Yeah, I mean, let me be blunt. I think when it comes to accepting loss, I think you talk about it there in the book that we as a people have always had to accept loss and give the golf clap and accept it like it's okay, but others don't necessarily do the same when it's in their backyard. And so, uh, break that down for us. What is it? It's based on what, entitlement?
Well, I think it's based on this idea and the fact that, as a group, because of white supremacy, whites have not had to lose as much as people of color, as African Americans in the history of the United States. And so there is a sense that they should be at the center of policy debates, that their views should predominate. And we saw that with the election of Barack Obama, where so many people were actually, on the one hand saying, "Oh, we've now achieved, a post-racial country, and the U.S. no longer has a race problem," and then other people who were so immediately, you know, um, just threatened by the idea of even having a Black president, and who resisted him every step of the way. And so, whatever you think of that administration, I think it's clear that there's this expectation of white priority, and that means that that whenever you have a situation in which um, the uneven distribution of loss, right, where Black people have had to accept a lot of loss, and white people comparatively less, when that is challenged, people respond with a sense of grievance and victimhood, and you see that fueling these moments of racist backlash.
I remember Tamika Mallory said at one time, when it comes to watching George Floyd and watching and understanding the plight, not just in the area of George Floyd's death and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery, that when it comes to looking at the systemic injustice, police brutality, this and that, all the things that we see communities of color consistently face, there is this aversion to the browning of America. And as there's this aversion to the browning of America, fighting for equal rights and fighting for equality and equity, is a huge uphill battle, and people are either allies or accomplices. Talk to me about the allies and the accomplices that we're seeing in the area of activism towards the fight towards equity.
Yeah, that's a very good question. So I think one of the concepts that I talk about in the book is this issue of how we think about loss and distinguishing between material and symbolic loss. And what I mean by this is that, something like the election of a black president at the end of the day didn't change the racial discrimination in the workplace. It didn't change police violence. It was what we might call a kind of symbolic gain. And yet there are people who are very mobilized to resist those kinds of things, right? The folks who get mad when you have a black actress playing Little Mermaid. These are symbolic gains that nevertheless mobilize people. And one of the things that I think is important to keep in mind is that there are people who might be willing to accept symbolic loss, right? So they'll put up the Black Lives Matter flag. They're fine with the statues coming down, but then when it comes to material loss, to, for example, how we change access to public schooling and how we change access to higher education, and does that mean that my child might not have the access to the educational institutions that I want for them, people become more resistant, and I think that's where you see often, the on the one hand saying I support these goals, but not if it means that I have to give up certain things in order to make things more equitable for everyone.
Yeah. Your book has a historical context to it, but it also has contemporary relevance. Talk to me about the fact of how your book is really being utilized and what you hope to be utilized in the areas of, diversity, equity, inclusion, because that's very real right now. And your book is helping to form some insight.
So I've been really pleased with the reception of the book. I think that it is, that people are finding it helpful in thinking precisely about how to respond to this moment of backlash, right? We're seeing people saying, for example, after they've, gotten the Supreme Court to disallow affirmative action in higher education, they're now going after, com- uh, companies that have programs specifically for minority groups and trying to get those disallowed. And so I think that one of the things that the book helps us to see is to put this in historical context and think about how this is a form of trying to reassert white priority, to engage in racist backlash, and how to think about the fact that in democracy, we are all supposed to lose. You can't win all the time. And so this resistance to saying, oh, having a program that tries to revert an existing injustice is somehow a loss for me, to thinking about how that is in fact a refusal to accept equity, and to try to reassert the dominant position of one particular group.
You talk about receptivity from a corporate environment. I want to ask you about how are students receptive? I'm very familiar with some of your background in my second home, Austin, Texas. I know you've been down there. And I know that, sometimes there is this resistance on the part of students of accepting reality for what it is. Talk to me about, as you have these conversations, as you're out there really laying it out in plain form, what's the receptivity like with students? Are they receptive to understanding this and adopting and moving, or is there a bit of resistance there too? Excuse me. Is there some resistance there too?
So I think that the points of view of students, I think, are varied. I think there's a lot. I think younger folks now, have grown up in a more diverse, environment than any other generation in previous history. And so I think we have a lot of people who are, on the one hand, much more open, much more committed to equality in various areas. And then we have people who are mobilized by that, right? Who are feeling displaced. And so I think, the reception from students has generally been positive, but I think we also have to be aware that even among young people, there are people who are, who are feeling like, oh, I'm being displaced from the position that I would have occupied as, a white person or a white man or whoever, or a white cisgender heterosexual person, 50 years ago, and who are very mobilized by that. So, so I think, on the one hand, young people are very progressive. I think quite generally more so, right? That's the common, commonly accepted, um, view that you are generally more liberal the younger you are. But I think there's also challenges because those are some of the folks who are also, feeling this kind of displacement, this sense of loss, of anticipatory loss, right? That the country is becoming different, and some people embrace that, and some people are very threatened by that.
Yeah. Do you find, I mean, you got a lot of people who've embraced your book, but talk to me about those who resist. Is that voice out there as well?
I mean, of course, right? So I think there are definitely people who feel, who feel that, on the one hand, this book is sort of, presenting Black people as victims, and that whole critique of when you actually, um, pay attention to the ways in which, white supremacy has distributed, gains and losses, unequally, and those burdens among citizens, that people find that very difficult to acknowledge. And I think that's why we're seeing, for example, things like book bans or all of these debates about what can be taught, in schools, and how should we teach U.S. histories, because people are very uncomfortable with having those honest conversations about, what the history of the country has been, and how do we think about what that means for how we move forward.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Julie, I mean, honestly, that last question was a setup question because really, what I really wanted to ask is, knowing that there's going to be this resistance out there, what do you give? What advice do you give to somebody who wants to find their voice and use their voice? Because it does take a certain amount of courage to come out with the book like you do, to lay out the facts and then also take the hits as well. So that's really where I was leading towards. How does one go about finding their voice to be able to navigate, particularly in a time when we're so culturally and divided as a country?
Absolutely, that's a really good question. I think it's this moment of very deep backlash, that we find ourselves in is a very difficult one to be somebody who is speaking out around, in favor, for example, trans rights or racial justice or the rights of women to control their bodies. I mean, these are times when you're going to be attacked for taking those positions. And I think the important thing here is if you are someone who feels like there is, an issue that motivates you and that you want to speak out on, um, is to really, first, I think, take care of yourself. You don't have to go and, engage with all the, the folks who are hostile, or, certainly making violent or threats or things of that sort. But I think the important thing is to put out your position out there, to have a clear analysis, and to try to engage people, and to, to make it, to make the best case that you can, and hope that folks will be open to having an honest conversation.
Well, it's been great having you. Thank you so much, Dr. Hooker, for being with us. And certainly got to have you back.
Thank you for having me.
All righty. We're taking a quick break, and guess what? We got more coming up right after this here on the Social Justice Forum. And welcome back. Most people know of Harriet Tubman as an abolitionist, as she was, but outside of her work to free the enslaved, she was like most Black women, multifaceted. Still, her work as the leader of the Underground Railroad will forever solidify her as an American icon and a global one. The Harriet Tubman Home Incorporated is an independent not-for-profit established by the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church to manage and operate the home of Miss Harriet Tubman. The Harriet Tubman Home is charged with sharing Harriet Tubman's core values with visitors through a guided tour of her property. And joining me to share more and give us some insight, I'm joined by the president and CEO of the Harriet Tubman Home, Ms. Karen V. Hill, and good to have you here.
I'm glad to be here.
You're here. I think this is the first time on this platform. I think we've had you on others, but glad to have you here on the social justice and glad to have this conversation.
I'm in the right place.
You're in the right place.
And this is the right time.
It is the right time. And so when we talk about Harriet Tubman, obviously her work as one who really fought to free slaves, and not just free slaves, was really about making generational impact. But I want to talk from that social justice component just from the outset, right? Because when we see Harriet Tubman, we're often put her in a box. But the reality is, before there was ever this quote-unquote social justice initiative, she was all about that life.
Right. Social justice was one of her core values. Okay, she had 7 core values: faith, freedom, family, community, social justice, equality, and self-determination. So I think a lot of what you provide to the community in exploring various issues relate back to Harriet Tubman's core values. And we give guided tours of her home, of her property, but then that's 32 acres. And so that begs the question of, how did a woman who could neither read nor write, born a slave, get to the point where she freed herself, her self-emancipation, that's an important principle, and then acquire 32 acres of land on which she built not only her homestead, but a home for the aged, and we're still grappling socially with how we care for seniors as they age. How do we treat people with dignity? An infirmary on the property where, even though she was discriminated against, her infirmary was open to both blacks and whites, and it was free.
Right. So let's back up for a minute. So somebody may not be so familiar, doesn't understand. Harriet Tubman does more than just free slaves. She has 32 acres of property on her own, and now this property is under the auspices of the Harriet Tubman Home, which is also connected with the AME Zion Church. And the AME Zion Church now is the one that's really responsible through the Harriet Tubman Home of really making sure that now her 32 acres are taken care of.
Right. So we're a national park. Okay. That was a strategic focus of the board to make sure that Tubman's legacy lives on in perpetuity. So becoming a national park was very important to us. Became a national park January 10th, 2017, right on time, right before the change in administration and change in so many policies. But so we've protected the land, we've protected the property, we're making improvements on the property. And, it's important that people understand the freedom component of the AME Zion Church as it lives through the work on the property of Harriet Tubman. And what's really important, what I like about your show, Daren, is that you constantly show how people activate their freedom, because that's what Tubman said. You have to activate your freedom. You have to use it in many different ways. She was a suffragist. So she knew that even though she might not get the right to vote, because when women got the right to vote, it didn't include Black women and women of color, but she knew that that was an important part of expanding their franchise of the vote. And we're still battling that. We're still fighting right now to not have voter suppression and everything else occur. She knew that owning the land was, in New York State, you needed to own land in order to be eligible to vote. That was one of the reasons she made a point of becoming a property owner, because then you had a voice. Okay.
And let's talk about that voice for a minute, because you, as the Harriet Tubman Home, have a job of really amplifying the voice of Harriet Tubman in the fact of letting people know the home exists, the work that she's done, and really taking that legacy and making sure that America and the world knows that. So give us a little bit about what goes on at the Harriet Tubman Home throughout the course of the year.
Well, every week, 5 days of the week, we provide tours to the public. And we have a really engaged public that comes, from school-age children. More than 50% of our visitors are school-age children. But we have a lot of seniors that come and everybody in between. During the summer, we have many educators who come, who teach history and women's studies, and they want to know the Tubman story, because before we activated our own freedom in telling Harriet's story, a lot of people were telling the story wrong, quite frankly. So what they do is they come to the Tubman Park and they discover that the real Tubman, the facts of Tubman, are so much greater than the myth of Tubman.
Right.
Okay, and then with that, so we see over 10,000 visitors a year. We're in Central New York, so it's a different environment. It's not an urban environment. She lived on the outskirts of Auburn, which really replicate very much the environment that she grew up in as a slave. It's semi-rural, and it's really important that Tubman had this consciousness that she could have this respect and love for the land and separate that for her absolute intolerance for the notion of slavery. Okay? So when she came north, she wanted something that very much looked like where she came from. And then the value of family. If you come to the Tubman Park, we have a lot of family reunions. Lots of family reunions.
On the grounds.
On the grounds.
Right.
On the grounds. And I feel so wonderful about the fact that now we're in this dynamic where we have many multicultural, multiracial families coming, and they're learning their history. They're learning, these are parents who want to make sure that their children grow up knowing all of their history. And you can leave with a little bit of her legacy. Like, I'm wearing the Tubman stamp, okay? They don't make these anymore, but when we had them, they were real hot for us. And now we have something new and great and wonderful.
Right, and we want to talk about that because there is something new and great and wonderful that just recently happened out in Philadelphia. And in Philadelphia, there is the unveiling of the Harriet Tubman coins. They're going to be commemorative coins that the public will now be able to reach and have in 2024. And tell us about this.
Well, on January 4th, we will start taking orders for the bicentennial commemorative coin of Harriet Tubman. So we have a 50-cent piece, we have a silver dollar coin, and we have a $5 gold coin. Now understand, the gold, it's going to cost much more than $5 because it's solid gold. Mm-hmm. But the important part about the three coins is it will allow everyone to have the Tubman legacy in their home that they pass down to generations yet unborn. And there'll be a brief narrative. On the 50-cent piece, it will highlight Tubman's time during the Civil War. And it will have her image on the front and back. On the silver dollar coin, it will highlight her time in bringing people north, bringing people to freedom. And then on the $5 gold coin, it will actually raise up Harriet's 54 years living in freedom in Auburn, New York, and her 7 core values are on the coin itself. And what's really important is that I feel like we have finally, on all the coins, there's certain things you have to have. And one of the things is, in God we trust. And that was so Harriet, because that's whom she trusted with everything. God was her North Star. That's whom she looked to. That's whom she communed with. And so the coins are going to be, they are exquisite. Everyone needs to have one.
How long will they be available?
Okay. This 2024 is the primary target, and hopefully we'll be able to sell them a little bit beyond the Harriet Tubman home. The U.S. Mint will only be able to sell them in 2024, but we'll be able to sell them a little bit beyond. And they are limited, but I think there's enough for everybody and everybody's family who wants to have that Tubman legacy. So we're going to be working really hard to get the word out, to get families prepared to purchase the coins and to make it happen.
And also, to be honest with our viewers, that there is a portion of the proceeds that actually are going to the Harriet Tubman home, and that's something that the government decided they wanted to do, recognizing the worth and the value and the contribution of Harriet Tubman.
Yes, so the U.S. Mint recoups their cost of creating and manufacturing the coins. And then beyond that, there's a surcharge. And the surcharge actually gets shared with the Harriet Tubman Home, Inc. and the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center in Cincinnati. So, this is a great, great moment. I'd like to see everyone embrace this notion of just having a coin. And you want the coin because that's your first taste. Okay, that's your first taste. And if everything goes the way I pray that they go and we get out and we all vote in 2024, then we can look for that $20 bill to come on in between now and 2028.
Amazing.
Yes.
And so what's it like for you, obviously, on a day-to-day basis, because you oversee the home and make sure the home is well taken care of. You got the preservation of the home. But then there's also that fundraising component and other stuff that goes on throughout the course of the year. So talk to us about yourself and the work that has to go on throughout the course of the year, because these things just don't happen overnight.
Right. They don't happen overnight. Have to segment myself because first thing in the morning, making sure that everything is all right with the home itself, because we're open to the public. That's like job one. We're coming on to the winter season. We're open year round. It snows in central New York, so we just need to make sure that we are prepared for that. And then engaging the community at different levels, locally, statewide, nationally, is really important. This legislation to get the coin was a consequence of my working closely with the former representative from the area, John Katko, to make it happen. And that's a big part of my job, is to see where there are legislative opportunities and how to make that happen. And then we are a part of all of the major nonprofit national associations that speak to the importance of preservation. And so I have a big task in front of me to deal with the land further. And I can't speak to it publicly right now, but it is something that is really spectacular. Now, as I engage the public, we now have a picture book coming out that was written primarily by an author in England who is of German descent, who wrote this incredible picture book about Anne Frank, who then approached us about Harriet Tubman, and we saw the similarities. And so that book is coming out in 2024. So I'll be promoting that book nationally and internationally. It is incredible. Okay, yeah. And that's another opportunity for us to fundraise.
Do you find that sometimes we have just put Harriet in a box in terms of she's just the one who freed the slaves, but there was so much more to her life than just freeing the slaves, and I think that education is power. I was just sharing with another professor on one of our other shows about just how the work that goes on.
Yeah, I mean, everybody seems to think that they know her story because, oh, Harriet Tubman, when I was in the fourth grade, I did a book report and talked about how she freed the slaves. Well, number one, that's really great and wonderful, but we get people corrected. Like, she didn't free 5,000 slaves. She freed 70, and then she helped another 70 directly, and then she provided directions for others. So getting the story straight is really important. So that's a big part of what we do. But then we get into, well, how is it that Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth and Frederick Douglass all were members of the Amy Zion Church? Frederick Douglass got his preaching credentials at the Amy Zion Church of New Bedford, Massachusetts. Sojourner Truth changed her name not far from here at the Mother Church, Mother Amy Zion Church, from Isabella Pumphrey to Sojourner Truth. And then we have Harriet Tubman. And I think that thread, we have so many resources in our community that sometimes I'll go down the block and see 4 or 5 different storefront churches. Okay, we have so many resources in our community that speak to our faith, but we don't activate that faith in every way. It's not inside the church. Your faith is activated outside of the church. And that's what Douglass and Truth and Tubman had in common, that they knew that their faith told them to go out, to make a change, to be the difference, to actually be the difference. So that's a big part of our story. And I hope that we, in the next year or so, we really, in a serious way, begin to make that connection more broadly known. And that becomes another opportunity. I'd like to be able to build a new visitor center on the property, totally respect the men and women of Zion who built the visitor center that is there now, and our public enjoys that. But we need a new state-of-the-art facility, much like your studios. Okay.
We put some work in there, right?
Yes.
Well, and some work has gone into here. Do you feel as though that more and more people are becoming aware of the life and the legacy of Harriet Tubman beyond school people? Because I think that you do a great job also, and I know, of not just educating students, but you do a great job of educating adults, legislators, and the whole 9 yards.
Well, that's really important. If I want her legacy to be taken seriously and to continue, it's important that the power brokers in every sector, in the private sector, legislatively, the big non-for-profits that wield a lot of power, that they truly know her legacy. And I'll be honest with you, I'm somebody, when I walk in the room to speak to Harriet Tubman, my first thing is show a proper respect for this woman, okay? We have very short memories in this country. And while I completely respect the work of Dr. King, Fannie Lou Hamer, Rosa Parks, all of our civil rights heroes and sheroes that we can quickly call up, all of them stand on the shoulders of this diminutive woman, barely 5 feet, who made the difference. She changed the mosaic of America. And Frederick Douglass recognized that. He recognized that. He said, Harriet, I have had the privilege of speaking in the halls of the Capitol to Congress, being invited to the White House. He had that great gift of oratory. But he said, if you didn't do the work that you did and that you are doing, the work that I do would not matter, because she provided the empirical evidence of the value of freedom, not just going from the South to the North, but activating that freedom,
right,
making it happen. That's why she was able to engage with Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton in the suffragist movement, which was 10 years old when she stepped into it. But she made the difference because she was the one who could go into a lecture hall and speak to black men why it was important for women to get the vote, knowing that Congress, that states would begin to take away the voting privileges from black men as they gave them to white women. But she understood that expanding the franchise of America was incredibly, incredibly important.
Are you finding that more and more people are expanding their palate when it comes to understanding who Harriet Tubman was? Because I think we spend a lot of time, just as I said from the beginning, she's the lady who freed the slaves. But when you start talking about the impact of people, you talk about her during the same time as Frederick Douglass, right? She lived during a contemporary with Frederick Douglass, or which we haven't even talked about, was that there's a connection to William Seward, who's also in Albany, who was responsible for her also being able to get these 32 acres as well.
Right. So, if you come to see her property, you come to the National Park, we are 1.5 miles on the same street as Seward House.
And William Seward is?
And William Seward, he was Abraham Lincoln's Secretary of State. He was the governor of New York State, and he was principally responsible for us purchasing the great state of Alaska, which was called Seward's Folly. But now it's the state with the richest natural resources. So he did us a great, great, great solid, if you will, in purchasing Alaska. But William and his wife, Frances, each of them were born into money, and they were staunch abolitionists. And Central New York used to be like the headquarters for the abolitionist movement. So that had something to do with Harriet making the decision to move there. And the Sewards would welcome Tubman into their home, and she would be an influencer. If she were alive today, she'd be somebody we would know who she is on Instagram. We would know who she is on X. Well, maybe she would have gotten off of X at this time, given the changes that have taken place. But she was an influencer, and she would step into those homes, and really tell people, this is what we need to do to expand the franchise. This is what we need your financial support to expand the franchise. I mean, she lived to be 91 years of age, and she was active the entire time. Understand that when she was in her 80s, like I think 85, 86, she traveled from Auburn to Boston to attend Colonel Shaw's funeral. And she traveled alone. And you know yourself, that's not an easy travel today with all the modern conveniences. But Tubman, she did it. And she did it to honor the man that gave her opportunity to serve in the Union Army. She served as a scout and a spy, because again, nobody thought that this little woman, 4'11", could actually have the intelligence. So they used to speak right in front of her, thinking that she didn't understand what was being said. She was the most effective scout you could imagine. But she was forceful because she led the men. She led the men on the Cumberland River raid, where she helped to free 750 slaves. Why was that important? Because the North needed, hoped, prayed that many of those slaves would be recruited into the Union Army to fight. Okay? She was the first woman to lead an armed raid. Imagine that. So a few years ago, the Uniform Military Intelligence Division of the Army inducted her into its ranks as a full member because of her ability to function as a scout, spy, and leader.
Let me jump in here and ask this question. Now that you talk about this recent, the award, we talk about the fact of now her coin is coming out.
Right?
We have a national park that's actually named after this name, the Harriet Tubman National Park. A lot of contributions and a lot of awards and recognition now. Where do you see the future ending up in terms of her legacy? Because there's still so much more work that is being done to preserve and also make people aware of the legacy that she's provided.
Well, if you ask me what is Karen's dream, okay, I would say we definitely need the visitor center, a new visitor center. We want to finish the preservation work on her residence. That's sort of job one. We want to shore up the other buildings on the property, the historic buildings. If you're in the historic preservation work and you're dealing with old buildings, there's always something that needs to be attended to. But I think with the use of technology and that we're able to, we should be able to communicate with the world through technology and have these centers, if you will, of where there is social injustice and how can Tubman's legacy pour into that and make a difference, where we're educating people, we're a part of the training. One of the important things that happened during the whole pandemic, during that tragic time when George Floyd was killed, we were closed because of the pandemic, but so many young people came anyway to the park, because even though the park was officially closed, you could stand outside of the park and kind of soak it all in. So that tells me that people have a thirst to know what Tubman did, and to, as you heard Dr. Freddie Haynes say, come through. Come through. That's what Harriet wants all of us to do, come through. So I would like us to have come through centers in strategically placed in the United States, where we're able to have people come to the Tubman Park. We train them, they go out, and they really influence the community around its priorities. The imprint of the Amy Zion Church is significant in the United States. And that church becomes much more powerful when its dynamic preachers take that message outside of the walls of the church, so that the people know that the Freedom Church is very much alive.
You have in Atlanta, people know in Atlanta, Dr. King, and they've got his visitor center there, and they've got a very wonderful, connected to Ebenezer Baptist Church. I think anybody who's involved in social justice makes that the place where they go. They get millions of visitors, right? When we look at Harriet Tubman, she's on the climb there, and getting there. What's it like for you knowing that when you see a Dr. King Center, that you are the person that's responsible for the stewardship of this great heroine?
Right. So, I have to be realistic. It's really hard to get people to recognize a woman, a woman did this. This woman, that she was not educated, and a woman of color. And we're in central New York. So it's not like we're in the Bronx or in Manhattan or in Atlanta. We're not in a major cultural center. So we need people to come and experience a different kind of life. Okay, and they need to know that in experiencing that different life, they put themselves in the position to be able to go back to where they came from and say, how do I take the lesson of Tubman with me wherever I go? I mean, we have some people who've been there 100 times to visit us. And each time they come, they say they learned something different. Yeah. And a big part of my job, quite frankly, is to make sure that the people who are not genuine, who are not telling the real story of Tubman, that they are diminished as the real story of Tubman grows larger.
I got to ask a question before we go. What's that like for you, going out to different places, and you see maybe a store with the Harriet Tubman T-shirts or people with the other stuff, and they don't necessarily know the whole story. How much do you get into the fact check and say, I am, and this is what it is?
I do. I do. If you want to get me riled up, first of all, because that's one of the things, anybody can sell T-shirts, but we do have T-shirts that tell the story of Tubman.
Right.
And people should not tell her story, should not be selling her goods if they don't really understand and appreciate who this woman was. I mean, they're going to know who she is, the real Harriet, because she's a force whose time has come. I mean, these coins are going to make a huge difference in telling the story. That $20 bill, the $20 bill is the most ubiquitous form of currency we have in this country, and there's no woman on our paper currency. When that happens, game over.
Person of color, right?
Yeah, person of color. Before you spend that $20 bill, you'll think about what you're spending it on.
Right.
Okay? Are you spending it wisely? Are you saving part of it? Are you helping your family? Those are the things. Are you being charitable? I mean, you'll have that Tubman 20.
Before we go, I gotta get this. I hear people say this all the time, and I need you to correct me. I freed a lot of slaves. I could have freed a whole lot more if they knew. And that was a...
Well, that one, if they knew they were a slave. Well, that one was true, but I did hear Mr. Byron Allen, whom I have great, great, great respect for. He had his Griot Awards on CBS, and he gave a Tubman quote about every dream begins with a dreamer. Harriet Tubman didn't say that. So those are the things that I'm constantly trying to help people honor her, but shape her with her own words.
Last thing I said before we go, she did not have a rifle. She had a...
Well, she had the pistol, and she did have a rifle that belonged to the family, but it was the pistol that she was able to keep in her skirt pocket. And it is true that she never lost anybody on any of her freedom campaigns. And, she would have shot you, because if you said you were going back, you were a liability. They would get the truth out of you.
Right.
And Harriet wasn't going to have that. She was faithful, but she was faithful and realistic.
Karen Hill, CEO of the Harriet Tubman Home, talking about not just the legacy of Harriet Tubman, but really how things are really moving forward with the Harriet Tubman Home. For more information, of course, that was at the bottom of the screen that you can get connected with Karen and the Harriet Tubman program, Harriet Tubman Home, I should say. All right, well, we come to the end of our show today. Hope you enjoyed this week's discussion on the Bronx Social Justice and Anti-Violence Forum. Now, if you want to rewatch this week's edition, yes, right here on BronxNet.org. And if you want to join on the conversation and present your point of view, yes, visit us on our social media at BronxNet TV. Join us next week. We continue to elevate the discussion, bring further awareness across the globe. I'm your host, Daren Jaime, saying take care and God bless.